Okay, I'll just share my screen. Hopefully this all goes well. And let's click on that. Share. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, and I'll begin. So good evening, everyone. Thank you to Generation Rent for inviting me along to present to you today. As Sophie said, my name is Darren Wilshire and I manage the private sector housing service for the London Borough of Camden. So my service is responsible for improving standards within the private rented sector. We respond to complaints. We license shared homes or houses of multiple occupation. And we also run the London Landlord Accreditation Scheme, which is for all London local authorities, and that's designed to try and help landlords become more professional, understand what they need to do to provide a better home experience for you as tenants. So just moving on. So today I'm going to be talking about repairs and getting them done. So what's the problem? Well, on the flip side, the good news is that most landlords will respond to disrepair issues. But unfortunately, there's always the small percentage that are slow to respond or just plainly ignore their tenants when they're raising issues around complaints. For example, in Camden, we get about 700 complaints a year from tenants. Now, when you compare that to over a third of households in Camden, that's over 30,000 households in Camden are in private rented sector. We feel that's significant undercounting, and probably a lot of that is about reluctance from tenants to report repairs because they're worried about revenge eviction because of that. So it's something that as a local authority we're keen to try and help and support tenants to get those repairs done, and part of that is trying to help you, let you know what you need, what you can do to try and help with that. Oh, sorry, too many buttons. So who's responsible for doing the repairs? Well, when I'm talking about landlord today, it's also important to bear in mind that I'm also thinking about managing agents where the landlord has delegated the response to repairs issues to them. So just think about that when I'm talking about that. So your landlord will be responsible for most repairs, and here's an example of most of those issues there. So just covering some of those in a bit more detail. So electrical safety, that's changed in the last year. So new regulations are now coming into force, which require landlords to check electrical installations every 5 years. Now, there's two different types of reports here. There's reports that are just for when they make a minor adjustment, but this is actually a full inspection report of all of the electrical sockets and anything electrical within the flat. So they should be able to provide that to you if you ever start a new tenancy. Something that's been in place for a very long time is all gas appliances should have an annual check. And again, the landlord must be providing the tenant with that gas safety certificate at the commencement of a tenancy, but also as and when they come to do the safety checks throughout the year. And then around fire safety, they need to make sure that any equipment's working. So if there's fire detection systems, smoke detectors. Now, if a battery goes in a smoke detector, it's normally expected that the tenant would do that because it's a very minor repair. But if they're wired in, then that's going to be the landlord's responsibility. And then there's other things such as any upholstered furniture they provide that must meet certain requirements, and if they get damaged as part of that, they should be able to fix that. Now, what I would suggest is that the most important thing, and ideally before you sign your tenancy agreement, is to check whether you've been delegated any repairing responsibilities within that agreement. So the assumption is that your landlord will do everything, but sometimes they may slip in there, or whether it's on purpose or actually they expect you to read the contract. Those, who reads all of the small print? I know I certainly don't. So to just make sure there's no surprises that you find out that you've got to carry out the repairs. So let's have a think about your responsibilities as a tenant, because you do have some. So you're not, one of the key things is that you need to use the home in a tenant-like manner. So I think the photo there seems to suggest that this isn't somebody using their property in a tenant-like manner, but that might just mean very small items of repair. So light bulbs, smoke alarm batteries, as mentioned before. There is an expectation that tenants would do that. What it doesn't certainly cover is through where there's general wear and tear to the property through normal use. So carpets, loose door handles, or a little bit of peeling paint or wallpaper. But what we would certainly recommend is any damage that you're responsible for before you leave as your landlord. Sorry, repair any damage you're responsible for before you leave, as your landlord could withhold some of your tenancy deposit to cover the costs of making those good. Sorry, press the wrong button. Too many there. And then when it comes to about repairs, it's always about allowing access. So make sure your landlord can come in at reasonable times, but they should be giving you 24 hours written notice. And if it's not convenient, you can always suggest an alternative time. But again, that very much depends on what the issue is. So let's go through some do's and don'ts if you've got a problem. So the most important thing to do is to contact your landlord first of all, to raise the issue with them. So important, if you're calling them, take notes of your phone conversation with dates and times. And then we strongly always recommend following it up in writing, whether it's letter, email, or text. So you've got a copy of what you've asked them. So if they fail to carry out repairs, you may need that as backup. And you should be sort of like telling them within that is what the issue is, and ask them for a timescale for the repair to be completed, and then also tell them that you're going to follow it up if there's no progress. So it shouldn't be a surprise if within a few days or a couple of weeks, if they don't hear from you, if you don't hear from them, that you're going to be calling them up again. You're expecting them something to do about it. I'm sorry, I've just hidden my buttons. Right, there we go. But the most important thing is, do not stop paying your rent. You do not have an automatic right to stop paying your rent, even if your health is at risk, the boiler or toilet are not working, or repairs are taking too long. Your landlord can take steps to evict you for withholding your rent. So it's really important to keep on paying that, even though they're not providing what they should be doing. Now, there's nothing stopping you for talking to your landlord and trying to negotiate a rent reduction if it's taking them longer to rectify something for you, because obviously you've paid for that service, so they should be providing it to you. So it's always worthwhile seeing whether you can do that. So what if no response still? So follow it up, send another email, text your landlord, remind them of when you reported it previously. Also state how it's impacting your health or physical or mental health, and then give them another reasonable time period for them to respond to that follow-up. You may want to mention at this time that you will refer it to the local council if you get no response, and hopefully that might be enough to get them geeing along to get something done for you. So after all of that, they're still blanking you, or they're just not taking the necessary action. So at this point, we would certainly recommend that you contact your local private sector housing service. Often they can be called lots of different things, but they're normally environmental health functions. So if you go through to your council switchboard, they should be able to put you right through to the right service. And they can take action under a variety of legislation, and some of them are listed here. This is not an exhaustive list, but they certainly in the private rent sector, they've got a lot more powers over the last few years to tackle issues within the private rented sector. So just wanted to talk a little bit around the HHSRS, or that's the Housing Health and Safety Rating System. So this is a risk-based tool used by councils to identify hazards. So there's 29 hazards. I mean, the top ones that we often get to consider are damp and mold growth, excess cold, fire, personal hygiene, sanitation and drainage. So officers will have a look at all of those when they come round to inspect your property if you call us in. And if they're doing their job, they won't just focus on the issues that you've called about. They'll be checking to make sure there's nothing else that your landlord should be doing. And that assessment will look at the increased likelihood of harm happening to you, and the severity of harm as well. It could be from a minor abrasion because you might slip or trip, or it could actually result in death if nothing was done about it. Now, this is quite a technical thing. The government are currently looking at trying to review the HHSRS, try to make it easier, more understandable for not only for landlords, but for tenants as well. But essentially, once they've done that calculation, they will, if it comes out that it's a category 1 hazard, then the council is then duty bound to take some action to get something resolved about that hazard. Now, there are things called category 2 hazards, so that's where the impact of the harm is at a slightly lesser level, and then the local authority has discretionary powers of whether they do that. Now, most local authorities will publish an enforcement policy which will tell you what action they will take if they come across such of these things. The typical type of response that the local authority will do is serve an improvement notice. Now, the importance about them serving an improvement notice on your landlord is then a landlord cannot use the no fault section of under section 21 to evict you. So it stays any ability for your landlord to evict you. So it's really important to, if you follow those processes to get your local authority involved, then you should be relatively safe from eviction. Now, I won't go into this in too much detail because Ellen is going to talk about that later, but there is action you can take yourself now, which again was recently introduced, but again, I'll leave that. But obviously this house just needs a little bit of work to it, I think a bit of TLC. So hopefully I've covered most of the key things around how to try and get repairs done. I certainly wouldn't say it's easy. I mean, obviously the cases we come across, there's lots of issues that we have, and often sometimes it's got to a point where it's too late, and then tenant and landlord are at loggerheads, and it's very difficult to try and mediate to get people to try and calm down and try and get the works done. But it really is important. I mean, we do appreciate that tenants, it's their home, it's the most important thing for them. So there are further changes coming. The government are really serious about trying to make improvements for the private rented sector. So they're looking to consult in introducing a national landlord register. So at the moment, there's no requirement for a landlord to register centrally that they're renting accommodation. Now, the importance for us is that enables local authorities to know where all their private sector housing is, and it means we can take proactive action with landlords to make sure they know what they should be doing. They're also looking at consulting and introducing an enforceable decent home standard for the private rented sector. That's something that's been around for a very long time for social housing. And again, it covers everything from HHSRS to home being thermally easily heatable and getting rid of just basic disrepair. So that will be interesting to see how that moves going forward. And then plans to crack down on rogue landlords. And that's all about fines and bans to stop repeat offenders. And what I would say is Camden recently secured 4 banning orders against some rogue landlords. And I think we've secured 7, which is about half of all banning orders nationally. So it's really key that local authorities make sure they use their powers to help tenants. And on that note, I think that's all I've got. So thank you. And I think we're going to deal with some questions at the end. So
thank you so much, Darren. And yeah, as you mentioned, please put some questions in the chat and we'll address them after the presentations. So that brings me on to Eleanor Solomon, who is a housing specialist lawyer at Anthony Gold Solicitors. And once Darren stops sharing his screen.
I'm just trying to do that. Oh, here we go. Oh, there we go.
I just took over. I did it that way.
Thanks so much. And everyone, yeah, put some questions in the chat and we'll address them after. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So I'm just going to whiz through some of the obligations that your landlord has to you. So Darren's talked more about some of the kind of regulatory obligations on landlords. So this is an obligation that you can't enforce yourself, but those are obligations that the council can enforce on your behalf. So I'm going to talk about what you can do, what kind of legal action you can take directly against your landlord. So where are the landlord's repairing obligations? The starting point is always the tenancy agreement, as Darren said, and the tenancy agreement will mainly mirror Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, which I'll go on to, but it may contain some other obligations on the landlord as well. So Section 11 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 says that the landlord has an obligation to keep in repair the structure and exterior of the building. So that's the outside of the building, the windows, the roofs, the walls, heating, gas, water, and electricity and sanitation supplies. So the landlord cannot contract out of that. They might write in their tenancy agreement that you're responsible for one of those things, but that would be a meaningless clause that would just be read as if it didn't exist. Your landlord has to absolutely repair those things. That's implied into all tenancies, and this applies to all parts of the building in which the landlord has an interest or owns. So if your landlord owns a whole block of flats, then that will cover the common parts as well. If your landlord only owns your flat, then they'll only have an obligation to repair your flat. They'll have an obligation in relation to the common parts to try and make the freeholder do other bits, but only to take their reasonable endeavours to do that. What Section 11 doesn't cover is design defects. So, for example, if your property is very mouldy due to a design defect, that won't be covered by the repairing obligations. This is just literally about repairing something that was working and has broken, although there may be other obligations to cover design defects. And other legal obligations your landlord has, Section 4 covers the obligations that your landlord has for repairs. So it means that they're not only on the tenant, but also on people living with the tenant, for example, tenants' children, housemates, etc. And Section 1 of the Defective Premises Act 1972 is a duty to build dwellings properly. So this will only really be relevant to you if your landlord actually built your building or, got somebody else to build the building if it's a relatively new building. So mainly this will be relevant for people in housing association or other new build properties. And then you have private nuisance, which is a common law remedy. So private nuisance is where something comes onto one person's land, from one person's land onto another person's land, and substantially interferes with their enjoyment of that land. So an example could be a mouse infestation. If the landlord owns the block as a whole and you've got mice running around the common parts and the infestation is so bad that it's inevitable that they're just going to start coming into the individual flats, then you would have a claim against the landlord who owned the whole block, or maybe against a particular neighbour in nuisance. Likewise, if you have a leak coming from one area into another, you'd have a claim in nuisance. And this is quite useful if it's actually not your landlord causing the issue, but the owner of a block of flats or a neighbouring landowner where the issue was coming from. Then you'd have a legal remedy against them in nuisance, but it could be against your own landlord as well, causing the nuisance to you. So Section 11 and nuisance are all very useful, but they were kind of leaving a lot of big gaps and a lot of scenarios where tenants were thinking, I'm living in a mouldy property, I've got mice, but actually they don't really fall under Section 11 or the law of nuisance, because for some reason it's not a repair issue, it's a design issue, or because the mice are coming from the garden, they're not coming from somebody else's land or something like that. So the Homes Fitness for Habitation Act 2018 applied to all tenancies from March 2020 onwards. So it doesn't apply to licenses, it only applies to tenancies. And it implies a term into the tenancy agreements that the tenancy is fit for human habitation at the time the lease is granted, and that it will remain fit for human habitation during the term of the lease. So what does fit for human habitation mean? We don't know 100% because we haven't had many cases tested in the court yet, but we're assuming we know what it means from other law, such as the Defective Premises Act that's been around for a long time, and actually even Victorian case law, which was in some ways more tenant friendly than recent case law. So we think it means that the property is not reasonably suitable for occupation in its current condition. So there are things causing discomfort and potentially causing health risks. What it doesn't mean is that the property is uninhabitable, which is something that we'll find landlords saying quite often. They're saying you can live there. It might not be very nice. It might be damp and mouldy, but it's not uninhabitable. You don't have to leave today. That's not what fitness for human habitation means, but exactly where it falls, we are yet to see in case law. If we're thinking about category 1 or 2 hazards, I think it's fairly safe to say that if there's a category 1 hazard, if the local authority come round and say there's a category 1 hazard here, then it's not fit for human habitation. In my opinion, if there's lots and lots and lots of category 2 hazards, it may also be unfit for habitation, but it's that's disputed at the moment. So when we're deciding whether a property is unfit for human habitation, we have to have regard to specific things in the Act. So we can't just say it's unfit in relation to anything. It has to be in relation to one of these things, which are very wide and will cover most things really. So repair, stability, freedom from damp, all these things. And then at the end, any prescribed hazard. And prescribed hazards are all the hazards in the HHSRS, the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, of which there are all of these hazards, absolutely loads of them. And they do really cover most of the things you can possibly hope to not have to happen in your home, such as collision and entrapment, explosions, excess heat. I mean, it's really, you don't come across many of them very often. And it can be that your home could be unfit for human habitation for a very short period of time. Like, for example, something we come across is if building works are being done and adequate safety measures aren't being taken, you could have all sorts of things like volatile organic compounds that you wouldn't normally have in your home. It's unfit for a short period of time, and then it's not again. But that your landlord's obligation is to have your home so it's never unfit for human habitation. So that's in a kind of whiz around what falls under the obligations your landlord has to you. I think we've already been over some of this, but there are some things which your landlord just has no obligation to repair unless it explicitly says so in the tenancy agreement at all. And these are minor things: fuses, light bulbs, you expect to change those yourself. Internal door handles and doors, I mean, it may be something which is covered if it explicitly says so in the tenancy agreement, but usually not. Toilet seats, minor plaster cracks, so a hairline crack is just a normal expected thing and wouldn't be covered. If you've got a great big crack in the plaster, then that falls under the repairing obligations. Dated kitchen and boilers is another thing that gets complained about quite often. Your landlord doesn't have any obligation to, keep things up to date and looking nice, even if it is horribly old, only to keep things in repair, and so they're safe. So what should we do? We're kind of going through the same ground again, so I'll whiz through it, but definitely report the problem in writing, take regular photographs of defects and take videos as well, so we can see if it's getting worse, and this is all looking to kind of support a claim. If you incur any expenses, then note those down. So for example, if you have a leak that damages some items, you have to throw it away, photograph it first, keep your receipts if you have to buy anything new. Ask the landlord for any copies of surveys or notes of work that they've done. You can make a subject access request to your landlord that will cover some of that information. So direct action in terms of the kind of things we're thinking about, like renters groups like Acorn, that might be possible, but do pay your rent and also do be careful, because I've just seen a case in the Court of Appeal last week, and in the High Court, I think, about a landlord being sort of targeted for direct action and then successfully suing the tenant and Acorn for defamation and harassment. So yes, do write to your landlord, do make very clear that you're very displeased, and you can even get other people to do that too, but make sure that doesn't veer over into publishing things about them in social media that could get you sued or harassing them. And how quickly should repairs be done? That really depends on what the repair is. So if you've got a leak of hot water from your boiler, then that should be come and turned off sort of within hours as an extreme emergency. If you have subsidence to your property, which is causing cracks, but nothing particularly major, that's going to take a long time to deal with. It could be literally years being a reasonable time, because your landlord's going to have to do monitoring before they can undertake any works. So it depends, but within a reasonable period of time is what the law says. So if you've complained and repairs are not done, what do you do? Do report it to the council, to the private sector housing enforcement team, partly because they can take action for you, and partly because what they provide can be quite useful evidence if you want to bring a claim yourself, because they often will come around and produce a sort of report or list of defects. And if you're bringing a claim yourself, you're not going to want to pay for a surveyor. So at least you have some evidence there. If you live in a HMO, a house in multiple occupation, check your landlord is licensed by contacting the council to find out, or with some councils you can find out online. And if not, you can potentially make a rent repayment order claim. That's absolutely nothing to do with repairs at all, but it is just a kind of useful tool in negotiating with your landlord to try and get them to compensate you and do repairs. And we often find that quite helpful, because the compensation you'll get for a year's worth of no HMO license is a lot more than the compensation for a year's worth of even the worst disrepair, because it can be all your rent back. If lots of people say my agent's not doing the repairs, my landlord's agent's not doing this. Well, your landlord's agent doesn't actually have an obligation apart from to the landlord to do anything. But that said, in practical terms, it is often them, and the landlord may be living abroad and know nothing about it. So if the agent is a member of a redress scheme, which you can find out on their website, then you can make a complaint to them, and it may work. So if you think that your landlord's in breach of the legal obligations, you may have a claim against them. It may be very difficult to actually get a solicitor to bring that claim, because there are a limit. There's just not enough housing solicitors for the need, basically. Legal aid is very, very limited. Lots of solicitors, including myself, work under no win, no fee agreements, but they're not really suitable for short-term disrepair or disrepair where the defendant is a landlord who's not likely to pay up very quickly. So you can have a go yourself. You may not actually want to start the claim in court, but you can certainly go through the housing conditions claims protocol by writing a letter of claim to your landlord. I put a link up there, and very helpfully, there is a kind of precedent letter as part of the protocol where you can just fill in the details and send this to your landlord and try and convince them that you are going to really start a claim in court. We might want to take legal advice before you actually start the claim in court, but it is possible. And we find that fairly often, if you just write a letter to the landlord threatening court proceedings and then kind of make an offer to settle the claim or not to if they do the repairs, and perhaps pay you a relatively small sum in damages, then that can resolve the problem. It's certainly worth a go. So that's the end of my talk, and I think we'll go over for questions. Let me stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Eleanor, and I think Tilly's going to share the link that you shared in your presentation in the chat, so that anyone who's listening can find that link. I'm going to answer some of the questions that were kind of given to us prior to this meeting, but it actually relates quite nicely to one of the questions from RJE about if our letting agent landlord is delaying or ignoring repairs, specifically with damp or mold in the case. I'll read out the question that we received, which is, I privately rent a room. The room's humidity is 85 to 90% during the day and 99% during the night, with respective temperatures of 14 degrees and 9 degrees. I've spoken to the landlord 3 times since November, and on the first occasion they couldn't find fault and have failed to attend since. What do I do? And I'll go to Darren first on this question.
Yeah, I mean, these are always quite difficult cases. I mean, I suppose I always start with asking for lots more information, really. But the key cause of high humidity is often boils down to a lack of ventilation, which just seems completely at odds to it's winter. Why would I want to open my windows and let all my heat out? But there's a typical thing, because obviously the issue with high humidity levels is that can often lead on to issues with mold growth and condensation on the walls, and then obviously that then starts potentially to have a negative impact on your health with the mold spores, particularly if people have asthma. So some of the key questions I would be asking, it talks about a room, I'll be asking, is there a kitchen off that or a bathroom off it? because when you've got a very small room, I mean, you're throwing off moisture even when you're breathing at night. If that's not ventilated, those levels can build up from just cooking, washing, putting washing out. And unless you ventilate that, it's just going to build up and start to create problems. And if there are extractor fans, just make sure they're used. And are there any openable windows? Because sometimes we come across sort of like flats where actually the only window is actually patio doors or French doors, where you can't really crack that open to provide that ventilation. So we would find that as an issue, and we'd have to instruct the landlord to do something about fixing that. So, I mean, I think it needs to ask all of those questions first about what could be causing that build-up, but typically it is going to be that lack of ventilation. Now, what can exacerbate that as well is lack of insulation to the walls as well. So if they're poorly insulated, they can get very cold, and then that's when that condensation gets on there, water pouring down the walls, and that's when you start your mold growth, and you just start in a cycle of washing down the mold, comes back, and then it can start affecting everything else. So it's really important to tackle, because those are really excessive levels, and it's something that you would need to just try to talk to landlord to see, because if there is no adequate means of ventilating the bathroom or the kitchen area, if they're part of it, then you might need to look at seeing whether we can get some extraction system in there to assist you to do that, to minimize those.
And then just moving on to Eleanor there.
Yeah, just to quickly add to that, I mean, I agree with all of that. I guess the question is there mold as well? Because likewise, I'd be thinking that there'd be mold coming soon if there isn't mold already with that level of humidity. Ventilation is mentioned specifically in the Fitness Act. I've never bought a ventilation case when there wasn't mold as well, because usually mold just develops when there's no mold, but in theory, it could be unfit for human habitation, and that's something that can be raised, pointed out to the landlord.
And okay, so moving on to the kind of next question that we've been provided with before. My landlord passed away but hardly did any repairs. My house is in severe disrepair and breach of safety regs, fire safety and electrical safety regulations. The council enforcement department don't issue improvement notice, and they said I would be liable as much as the landlord's family if something happened. To top it all off, I've had a brick through the window, and now I've been served a Section 21, and it will be issued when probate is granted. I have a 25-year-old son with disabilities and ill health, and I have mental health issues as I'm a caregiver. I've been accused of damage, obstruction, and inappropriate behaviour because I was asked for competency regarding building regulations. I've been doing my own case management for 6 months, and luckily I've been studying law and have knowledge of housing law. Why is it so difficult to get legal representation in a disrepair case? And I'll go to Eleanor first with this question.
There's a huge amount of issues in there, really. The actual question, why is it so difficult to get legal representation in disrepair cases, is because it was mainly done by legal aid practitioners, and legal aid practitioners have been very, very heavily hit since 2013 with big changes to legal aid, limiting it and meaning that you don't get very much money from it. And then, I mean, this is a whole tangent really, but personal injury claims had fixed costs brought in, and then lots of people went into disrepair claims that have been doing personal injury before, and they weren't necessarily experts in disrepair claims. It was just a kind of case that they could get money from. So unfortunately, there are quite a lot of disrepair practitioners out there who aren't very good. And if you think that your solicitor isn't very good, then you can make a complaint first to your solicitor and then escalate that to the SRA, because if they haven't done anything since January, and I'd ask them explicitly what they've done as well, because from January to March, I'd expect them to have followed the disrepair pre-action protocol. But there's a huge amount of issues in here. So a brick through the window, obviously that needs to be reported to the police if it hasn't already, and that is potentially a kind of unlawful eviction type claim as well, which can be added to the disrepair claim, a harassment type claim. And also they say that Section 21 will be issued when the probate is granted. Obviously, if the local authority can be persuaded to serve an improvement notice, and if the condition of the property is actually of the state where an improvement notice is relevant, then those Section 21 proceedings can be put off, and that can be invalid until the condition of the property is improved. But I think there's another question in here, which is, why is it so difficult to get the council to do anything as well? So I wonder whether Darren has any views on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it very much depends on your local authority and the level of resourcing. Obviously, austerity has had a big impact on lots of local authorities where, many have had their overall budgets cut by 60%. And actually it's just trying to maintain that frontline service. I mean, I think you should persist with the local authority, definitely, because if they're not responding and you feel that there is an issue there, certainly sometimes you just may need to escalate it or raise it with a councillor. Sometimes they can be helpful in supporting tenants with issues that they have. But certainly do keep on pursuing it. I mean, one of the other things I was just going to say, because I did have a quick read about this before, obviously the death of the landlord, one of the key things for most people to understand is that the death of the landlord doesn't result in the end of the tenancy agreement. That will stay in place. But I suppose my next question is, who's managing the property now? Whom are you paying rent to? Because obviously what you don't want to be doing is paying rent to somebody who has passed. Now they might have a partner that's a joint owner, so you might want to say, well, should I be paying the rent to you? But if you're not sure, then I think the general advice is put those payments aside in a separate account, so that when you do know who to send it to, you can sort of like make the payment in lump. But yes, I think in this sort of case, it's quite complicated, and certainly just pursue it with your local authority.
Thank you. And the next question I have is, I've had to buy a fridge and freezer as my other one was broken, and got a new shower as the heating had broken, plus a new pipe under my sink as it was leaking. So I've spent altogether £475. I've told my landlord I've had to get these items and have them fitted, which I had to pay for. My landlord wants their rent, but I've had to buy these items and the rent was £500, so I owe him only £25. I have a skin and chest and lung condition due to a work accident in 2018. What are my rights? And I'll go to Darren this time.
Thanks. So again, I think it would be just have a check on your tenancy agreement to see what you're responsible for. I assume the fridge came as part of the rental agreement, but if it was yours, you brought it in, then it will be your responsibility. I'm hoping it's not very clear on whether you'd already contacted your landlord to tell them about this repair, but certainly before you would take action with doing the repairs yourself, what should have happened is have a discussion with your landlord and get agreement from them that you can do the repairs. Unfortunately, if you don't do that, there's no guarantee you'll be able to recover your costs, because they said, well, you haven't given me the opportunity to do the repairs, or you didn't tell me about it. So I think that's the key thing. But obviously gather all the repair, hopefully you've got evidence about what the issues were before, because they might even challenge you on the costs as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is a process by which you can do repairs yourself if your landlord's not doing them without agreement, but it is a very, very specific process that has to be followed, and it is helpfully on the shelter website. So you have to report to the landlord in writing twice, then you have to obtain 3 quotes from reputable contractors, send them to the landlord, warning them that if they don't do the work, the tenant will use the cheapest of the 3 contractors and deduct the cost from future rent. So this all has to be done in advance. Give the landlord a reasonable time to respond, which should be in that letter. And then if they still don't respond, then you may proceed with the work, pay the bill and send a copy of the receipted invoice to the landlord. So this very complicated and long process, which is set out in a case called Parker and Is It, has to be followed if you're going to do that. Otherwise, unfortunately, you had no obligation to do those yourself, and you can't just take the money out of the rent. I mean, with the fridge freezer as well, even if the fridge freezer was in the property when you moved in, unless it explicitly says in the tenancy agreement, then that's not something that landlord was even obliged to repair themselves. I mean, you weren't obliged to repair it either, but just nobody has a legal obligation to repair it, unfortunately.
Great. And I'll move on to some questions in the chat. Thank you both. If our letting agent landlord is delaying or ignoring repairs, specifically with damp and mold in my case, and therefore not upholding their end of the tenancy agreement, what's their best way to approach an early release from the tenancy agreement without penalty? And I'll start with Eleanor this time.
Right, so obviously if there's a break clause in your tenancy agreement, you can just use that and simply leave. I'm guessing that there's not. There is no right to end the tenancy early unless from the very, very beginning your tenancy was furnished and it was unfit for habitation, and then you can use a case called Smith and Marable to repudiate the tenancy and leave, and that has to be happening almost from the very first moment that you moved in. So in most cases, it is a kind of negotiation type thing, and it's something that I help tenants do very, very frequently. And the best way is to, in my experience, do contact the council, and at the same time also send a letter of claim, use the disrepair pre-action protocol, and then say to the landlord, here's a letter of claim, I'm going to take you to court for damp and mold, here's how long it's been going on for, this is how terrible it is, these are the pictures. But actually, if you just let me leave, then I won't seek any compensation from you, and also I won't require you to do the repairs, and we'll leave it at that. And in many cases, landlords don't want the hassle and will let you leave. They may say, give me a month or two to find somebody else. If they do that, that, to be honest, might just be the best case scenario, even though it's unfortunate. And try and reach an agreement between the landlord and you. It shouldn't have to happen. It should be that they should be compensating you for this, but it might be a pragmatic solution.
Darren? I think you're on mute.
I've got nothing to add to that.
Okay, and so the next question is from Brian Latham in the chat. My rented property failed the electrical assessment, no earth cabling and metal switches and sockets. Before I moved in, the landlord promised to get the issues fixed after I moved in. 3 months later, the work still hasn't been fixed and the agent isn't taking it seriously. Darren, go to you first.
Certainly. I mean, I think the important thing is that you're already aware of it before you moved in. And I think if you've already raised the issue with the landlord or got records of that, I think just advise them that if you don't get a response within a certain period of time, you're going to go to the local authority. Depending on the type of defect, the landlord should be informing the local authority of that, and then they're required to provide us with information that it's been rectified, and that's all within the new regs around the electrical safety. So I think take it back to your local authority, and they should be able to take enforcement action against the landlord.
Eleanor, have you got anything else?
Not really. My knowledge of electrical issues isn't good enough to say whether that would make it unfit for habitation or how dangerous that is. I know it's actually quite common to not have earth cabling, so I'm guessing it's not that dangerous. So probably the local authority rather than a private remedy is the best way.
And we have a couple more questions in the Q&A feature, so I'll just ask them to you. If rainwater is leaking through a light fitting, would this fall under HHSRS?
Shall I come in on that?
Yeah, go.
I mean, HHSRS is, although there's a picture of time where that could be dangerous. I mean, I suppose it depends on whether this is something that's been going on for a very long time. If it's a one-off, then it's unlikely to create a category 1 hazard. But if there's another issue, such a leak in the roof, so that every time it rains, water's leaking through, then I think it's likely to trigger some sort of HHRS hazard that needs to be rectified, because at the end of the day, that's going to start affecting the wiring and connections.
And Eleanor?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if there's water coming through a light fitting, it needs to be dried out, and then an electrician needs to come round and check it. And that's going to fall almost certainly under Section 11 and probably under fitness, especially if it is ongoing.
And I have another question. Can you get legal aid to fight the landlord for disrepair cases? So maybe I'll go to Eleanor to that question.
You can, but only if there's a serious risk to health, and you can only get legal aid for the duration of that serious risk to health. So a common scenario is that you'd have lots and lots of things wrong with your property. Only one of them is a serious risk to health. And then really annoyingly, the legal aid will just stop halfway through court proceedings, not enabling you to act, and you're stuck with an open court case. So it's not appropriate in many circumstances. We mainly just use it where there's an interim injunction. And it's not available to get any compensation. It's only available for an injunction. So you're probably better off finding a solicitor that will do a no-win, no-fee agreement, or a combination of both.
And Darren, have you got something you'd like to add on that?
No, I haven't on that one. Thank you.
And we have another question in the chat. I've been trying since November to get the landlord to fix the heating. It's stuck on high. It's boiling and costing me money. They say that they're going to do it, but they never do. Any advice?
Again, I think if they're just not listening to you, raise it with your local authority immediately, because I mean, it's bad enough that you're not able to control it because that can lead to excess heat, but with the increasing costs in fuel bills, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So yeah, certainly raise that with your local authority immediately.
Yeah, I would also send your landlord some before and after heating bills and ask them to reimburse you for the additional heating cost, because and write a letter of claim and put that as one of the things you're going to claim against the landlord is your high heating bills. Hopefully that will be an incentive for them.
And so that actually brings me to the end of some of the questions that I've had in the chat. But if anyone has something they'd like to add in the chat, please do so. This is the golden moment. So, but it's been great to really hear from both of you, and such a wealth of experience and knowledge really in this area. And I've actually learned a lot from this. And I think if I ever have a problem, I'll definitely use some of your advice. And also kind of going back to the link that we have in the chat about making a claim, that's really helpful. So please, everyone, use that. But if anyone else doesn't have any questions, I'd just like to thank you, Darren, for your presentation, and also to Eleanor as well, to your presentation and to answering the questions so eloquently. And if no one has any questions, I think that might bring us to the end of this webinar. So I might defer to anyone here, but thank you both really for your help. So yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for listening.
And just as a throwaway thing, I'll post in the chat just where to get involved with Generation Rent. Sorry, I meant to have the link on me and then forgot to bring it up. So
yeah, but yeah, obviously, if you want to hear more about what Generation Rent's doing, you can go to generationrent.org, and we'll keep on in contact with you and look forward to having more events in the future. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice evening.
thanks, everyone. Bye.